we are at the very heart of logic, that is inference. We already started the meaning of inference, various kinds of inference, and we limit ourselves to only one kind of syllogism, namely categorical syllogism. A syllogism that consists of three propositions, all of which are categorical propositions. So we are considering that one. So Aristotle has given 8 rules for the categorical syllogism, very important, and those rules stand valid even after more than 2000 years. It remains valid. The first 4 rules we have already seen. Out of the 8 rules, the first 4 are dealing with the terms, and the second 4 are dealing with the propositions. Now, just to recapitulate what we have seen, which we are supposed to have recapitulated, a syllogism must contain 3 terms and only 3 terms, and they are to be used in the same sense throughout the syllogism. Throughout one syllogism, a term is used at least twice. Therefore, in those 2 places, the term should not have different meaning. So, and there was only 3 terms, and we have seen what are those 3 terms: the major term, minor term, and the middle term. And also we also referred to the 3 propositions, namely the major premise, minor premise, and the conclusion. Major premise is the premise where the major term occurs. Minor premise is the premise where the minor term occurs. And major term is the predicate of the conclusion. Minor term is the subject of the conclusion. And the term that comes only in the premises and not in the conclusion, that is the middle term. So that is the first rule, only 3 terms, and not more, not less. Then there's rule number 2, no term can be more extensive in the conclusion than in the premises. That means if any other term in the conclusion is universal or is distributed, then it must be distributed also in the premises. There are 2 terms in the conclusion, the subject and the predicate. Look at those terms in order to see whether this rule is applied or not, or is realized or not. Look at the subject. If it is a universal term or term that is distributed, then make sure the same term is distributed also in the premise. And look at the other one. If it is a particular term, then you don't have to look at it. No problem. If it is a universal term, if it is a term that is distributed, then make sure the same term is distributed also in the premises. That is the meaning of no term can be more extensive in the conclusion than in the premises. And that is put in different term. In other words, if any other term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premises as well. Okay, then we have seen some of the examples, and to see whether the term the term in the conclusion are distributed or not, and then if they are not distributed in the premises, then it is an invalid syllogism because it has violated this particular rule. And most of the time, how it becomes particular, if the term is predicate of an affirmative proposition. Predicate of affirmative propositions are always particular. Predicate of negative propositions are always universal. Now I don't have to repeat this one again and again. Predicate of the affirmative propositions are always particular. Okay. Now the third rule is, that is, it is not necessarily to use it as a rule because the middle term may not appear in the conclusion. Rarely it happens. But in case by chance you make a syllogism where the middle term is also found in the conclusion, then it is invalid. Middle term should remain confined to the premises and not in the conclusion. And the fourth rule is the middle term must be understood in the universal sense at least once. So this is another rule that can be easily violated. Just as the second rule and the fourth rule that are easily violated. What does it say? The middle term must be understood in the universal sense at least once. Twice the middle term comes. In both the premises, the middle term is there. It is not there in the conclusion. It is there in each of the premises, and therefore in one of the premises, at least in one of the premises, it must be used the universal sense, or it must be distributed. If both are distributed, no problem. We are not saying, when you say at least once, that means it may be distributed in both the cases. There is no problem. The syllogism remains valid. But if both the places it is undistributed, in both the cases of the middle term, in both the premises, if it is undistributed, then the syllogism is invalid. And we have seen some examples. All monkeys are mortal, all donkeys are mortal, hence all monkeys are donkeys. It may appear to be correct, but then not so. Why? What has gone wrong in this syllogism? It has violated this particular rule. All monkeys are mortal, all donkeys are mortal. Mortal is the middle term, and that middle term is functioning as the predicate in both the cases, predicate of affirmative proposition. The first premise and the second premise both are affirmative, and the middle term is used as the predicate. Naturally, the middle term is used in the particular sense in both the instances, and therefore the rule is not realized, namely at least once it has to be used in the universal sense. That is not followed, therefore it is an invalid syllogism. Now we go to the next four rules, and we call it rule number 5. What is the rule number 5? They are not that difficult, for the last rules, except slide 1. From two negative premises, no conclusion can be drawn. Easily we can apply. If both the premises are negative, we cannot draw. Whatever conclusion you may draw, it remains invalid. If both the premises are negative, then you can draw a conclusion, but it will not be logically correct. I cannot give an example, because even if whatever example we give, no monkeys are rational, no man is a monkey, therefore both are negative. Therefore we cannot conclude anything logically from two negative premises. Then sixth one, if both premises are affirmative, the conclusion cannot be negative. If both the premises are affirmative, we cannot get a negative conclusion. In other words, put it positively, if both the premises are affirmative, the conclusion also will be affirmative. So instead of putting that way, Aristotle has put the opposite way. If both premises are affirmative, the conclusion cannot be negative. If you happen to hit upon a negative conclusion, but the premises both are affirmative, then it is not a valid conclusion. So if both premises are affirmative, the conclusion cannot be negative. The seventh rule, that is, of course, that is slightly little different. The conclusion must always follow the weaker part. So that is the only rule in the second section of the rule, only rule that is slightly difficult, not very difficult, but then only slightly difficult, which we can fall in the mistake can be made in this by violation of this rule. Now, what is the meaning of the conclusion must always follow the weaker part? Now, what is the meaning of weaker part? I have given there. By weaker part is meant the particular and the negative. The particular is weaker in comparison to the universal. The negative is weaker in comparison to the affirmative. Therefore, if you find in any of the premises is weak, that means either affirmative, either negative or particular, then the conclusion has to be either negative or particular or both. I hope you understood. Or both. That means there are two premises are there. 1, 2. This is the conclusion. So, if one premise is negative, the other premise is particular, naturally, the conclusion must follow the weaker part. Whatever weakness is there in the premise has to be reflected in the conclusion. If any one premise is a negative, other one is affirmative, naturally the conclusion has to be negative. If one premise is particular, naturally the conclusion has to be particular. Suppose one premise is particular, the other is negative, the conclusion has to be negative as well as particular. So whatever be the weakness means it is not don't take in the literal sense of the term. In comparison to the universal, particular is weak. In comparison to the affirmative, negative is weak. If anything you find either negative or particular, then it has to be reflected in the conclusion. The conclusion must be particular if any of the premise is particular. The conclusion must be negative if any of the premise is negative. The conclusion must be both particular and negative if you find both these aspects in one premise or both the premises. So that is the meaning of this particular rule. The conclusion must always follow the weaker part. What does it mean? So it's a nice question to ask. What does it mean? Conclusion must follow the weaker part. So don't take the literal sense of the meaning of weaker. It means that, okay, I have already explained. I don't know, just explain again. So here I give one example. All Indians are Asians. No Asian is honest. Hence, no Indian is honest. It is a correct syllogism, because we find one of the premises is negative. Therefore, the conclusion also is negative. The other example, all whales live in water. All whales live in water. Some mammals do not live in water. So there, what do you find there? So we find in one premise is both negative as well as particular. Some mammals do not live in water, particular. Do not live in water, negative. Therefore, the conclusion has to be both particular as well as negative. And that is what is given there. Hence, some mammals are not whales. Therefore, some mammals are not whales. It is both particular as well as it is negative. And then finally, the eighth rule, if both premises are particular, no conclusion can be drawn. So it is, if both the premises are particular, no valid conclusion can be drawn. So these are the four rules related to the premises, not premises, to the propositions. So, what are they? From two negative premises, no conclusion can be drawn. Then the conclusion, but if both premises are affirmative, the conclusion cannot be negative. And then again, the conclusion must follow the weaker part. And finally, if both the premises are particular, conclusion, no valid conclusion can be drawn. So it is in fact very easy, the four rules to remember, namely, if both are negative, if both are particular, no valid conclusion can be drawn. Then, if both are affirmative, the conclusion has to be affirmative or it cannot be negative. And then the only rule of some importance is if the conclusion must always follow the weaker part. So these are the 8 rules of categorical syllogism. So it is not enough just to study the rules, study the explanation. I have given only the minimum explanation and example, and show why this particular example that you give is invalid. Then there is a matter. Otherwise, you write just the rules for the exam, especially for the university exam, and that is not enough. You need explanation. Explanation means you give an example and show why that example is violating the rule. In what way? When you explain, as I have given explanation, then there is enough of. Otherwise, if you remain with the minimum, then you will get also the minimum. Yeah. So now we are in the section of syllogism or inference. And inference, after having seen the various kinds of inference, we came to syllogism, categorical syllogism, and the rules of that one. And now we are going to just another point under syllogism, namely figures of categorical syllogism. Figures of categorical syllogism. What are them? First of all, what is, I don't know, I write it on the board. Figure is the form of syllogism as determined by the position of the middle term in the premises. Every word is important. We cannot formulate in a better way or more precisely. As figure is the form of syllogism, the shape of the syllogism. What is that shape is depending on what? As determined, as decided by the position of the middle term in the premises. By the position of the middle term in the premises. Because middle term only in the premises. And the position can be anywhere. It can be subject, it can be predicate in the first premise or the major premise or in the minor premise. But then according to the position of the middle term in the premises, we have, that is called the figure. The shape or the form of syllogism as decided, as determined by the position of the middle term in the premises. Now there are 4 possible figures are there. 4 possible figures. So they are given in the form of MP, SM, SP, PM, SM, SP, MP, MS, SP, and then PM, MS, SP. So this is the first one is the major premise. The second one is the minor premise. And the last one is conclusion. In conclusion, we find SP. S stands for the subject, P stands for the predicate. But in terms of syllogism, we can say S stands for the minor term and P stands for the major term. So here in conclusion there is no difference. Conclusion remains the same, subject and predicate, or major term and the minor term and the major term. Now, where do you find the middle term? In the first figure, in the first figure, so this is the first, second figure, third figure, fourth figure. In the first figure, we find the middle term in the first premise, middle term as a subject. In the minor premise, the middle term is predicate. In the second one, in both the cases, the middle term is predicate. In the third case, in both the cases, the middle term is subject. And in the fourth case, in the major premise, middle term is predicate, but in the minor premise, middle term is subject. So all the four are different. These are the different combinations. And thus, there are four figures. So, those four figures we must know, and how we have made it, depending on the different position the middle term occupies in the premises. And thus, there are only four possible. There is nothing else. Only four possibilities are there, and these are the four possibilities. Now, we are going to see is related to the four figures some of the rules. Rules are not, it is not exactly rules, although we use the expression rules. Application of the general rules to categorical syllogism brings out specific rules for each of the figures. Application of the general rules, whatever we have studied for the 8 rules, when those 8 rules are applied specifically to each of the figure. So we are taking each figure separately, and when we apply specifically to each of the figure, we find some specific rules. So I wouldn't say, I would say, I wouldn't use the expression specific rules, although I have put it there, because that is the way commentators are using. But I would say as a result of applying the general rules, we find some characteristics, some specificities with regard to each of the figure. And you will understand it as we go further. The first figure, that is MP, SM, SP. So with regard to the first figure, when all the rules are applied, we find certain result. What do you find? That is, the major premise must be universal. So in the first figure, the major premise will be universal. Will be because if you really follow the 8 rules, they are the foundational rules. If we follow, then we will see the first figure will have the major premise universal. The minor premise must be affirmative. It will be there. It will be affirmative. There is no other way. If you have to be serious with regard to the 8 rules. Now, I have given explanation. It is enough, I could stop. I have given explanation in the notes. Logic, best thing is to have, even if you write down, is better to have the notes. You are not going to get these notes which is so precisely formulated. Okay, history of philosophy you may be able to note down, but this, if you make one mistake, it is a mistake. But you will have to write down as well, because otherwise it will not enter the mind. So I'm just repeating, saying the same thing. So you all should have the notes, unless you are super clever. Okay, now two rules are given. Now we will see why these rules came about. Why these rules came about. And for that one, now what are the two specific rules? The major premise must be universal. The minor premise must be affirmative. Why do we say so? And for that we start with the second rule. We put it, supposing the minor is negative. This is the one. Supposing the minor is negative. What is the minor? This one. If the minor is negative, this minor premise is negative, what will be the result of that one? If the minor is negative, the conclusion will be negative. This is negative, then what happens? The conclusion will be negative. What is the rule? The conclusion must follow the weaker part. The conclusion must follow the weaker part. Here it is negative. Therefore, this also will be negative. It has to be negative. Seventh rule. Then, if conclusion is negative, the predicate of the conclusion will be what? The predicate of negative propositions are always universal. The predicate of negative propositions are always universal. At least 10 times I have said this thing. You did not tell because it's in the schema I have given. Predicate of the negative propositions are universal. Therefore, since the conclusion is negative, the P in the conclusion will be universal. If the P in the conclusion is universal, naturally the P in the major premise has to be universal. Why? Because no term can be more extensive in the conclusion than in the premises. Here it is universal. If it is universal here, it has to be universal also here. If any other term is distributed in the conclusion, the term has to be distributed also in the premises. So P in the major premise has to, or major term must in the premise has to be distributed or has to be universal. And how it is possible? P happens to be the predicate here. Therefore, it can be made universal only if it is a negative proposition. Now use your brains. Only if it is a negative proposition, because predicate of the universal propositions are always predicate of the negative propositions are always universal. We need to have P universal in the major premise. That is possible only if you make the major premise a negative premise. Negative. What is the result then? The result is both will be negative. Both will be negative. And then the rule says from two negative premises we cannot conclude any valid conclusion. So now, therefore, it has to be affirmative. So we are proving negatively, indirectly. How we are proving? The impossibility of the minor premise being negative. And if it cannot be negative, naturally it has to be affirmative. So I just repeat once more, be attentive, because already I have printed and kept, be attentive. So we are just imagining, supposing the minor premise is negative, then the conclusion has to be negative, because conclusion follows the weaker part. If the conclusion is negative, the P in the conclusion will be universal. Predicate of the negative propositions are always universal. If the P in the conclusion is universal, the P in the major premise also has to be universal, because the rule says no term in the conclusion can be more extensive than in the premises. If for making the P in the major premise universal, we have to make the major premise negative. And that means both will be negative. When both are negative, no conclusion can be drawn. Therefore, the minor premise has to be affirmative. So we are proving it, showing it indirectly, showing the impossibility of the minor premise being negative. We are saying if it's not negative, there is no in between. If it cannot be negative, it has to be affirmative. Then now we come to it's easy to come to the first rule. Since the minor is affirmative, now we have proved that one. Yes, M, the minor is affirmative. Naturally, the M in it will be particular, because the predicate of the particular propositions are always, the predicate of the affirmative propositions are always particular. This is, we have shown, it is affirmative, and the M here will be particular, because predicate of affirmative proposition is always particular. Is M here is particular, the M here has to be universal, because the middle term has to be distributed at least once. At least in one instance, the middle term has to be universal or distributed. And therefore, how to make the M in the major premise distributed? Only by making it a universal proposition. Because when the subject is universal, the proposition is a universal proposition. And that is what we have said. The major premise must be universal. The major premise must be universal. So these are the two rules. It's only just a matter of going through. When you are dissipated, we won't get it. We have to be now we cannot go on repeating the same thing. What is the meaning of, what is the predicate of the negative proposition will be always always universal or distributed. The predicate of the affirmative propositions are always undistributed or particular. That has to be already established, inscribed in the mind. Then the 8 rules. When you apply those 8 rules, we find that it is impossible for the minor premise to be negative, and from the impossibility of the minor premise being negative, we are proving that it has to be affirmative. Then we can come to the first rule. If the minor premise is affirmative, the M in that will be particular. If M here is particular, the M in the major premise has to be universal. At least in one instance, the M has to be distributed or it has to be universal. And therefore, how to make it universal? By making the major premise a universal proposition. And that is in other words, the subject has to be universal. Then it becomes a universal proposition. That is the first rule, the first figure. The second figure is PM SM. The middle term is predicate in both the cases, in both the premises. Middle term is predicate in both the cases, PM, SM. And this, again, 2 specific rules are given. Specific rules are evolving as a result of applying the 8 rules. So that is the basis. They are the basis. So what are they? One premise must be negative. One premise must be negative. So there are 2 premises are there, PM, SM. After that one must be negative. Why it has to be negative? Because in both the premises, the M is serving as the predicate. And if at least, one has to be negative, only then M can be universal in one instance. At least in one of the premises has to be negative. As a result, what we get, one will be universal. Either this or that. So any one of the premises has to be negative, because in both the cases M is the predicate, and they can be made universal only if at least one of the premises is negative, because M in both the cases it is a predicate. So that is the first rule. Secondly, major premise must be universal. Major premise, even in the second case also it is the same. The major premise must be universal. Why so? Because that, I think those of you remember the previous rule, we can immediately understand. One premise we have come, one premise has to be negative. If one premise is negative, any one premise, naturally the conclusion will be negative. If the conclusion is negative, the P of the conclusion will be universal, because predicate of the negative propositions are always universal. If the P in the conclusion is universal, no term in the conclusion can be more extensive than in the premises. If the P in the conclusion is universal, naturally the P in the major premise also has to be universal, which is possible only by making it a universal proposition, because the subject becomes universal, and thus we have a universal proposition. And these are the two rules with regard to the second the second figure. I stop here.